Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Ray Luján.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all today for this important conversation as we remind ourselves of a U.S. Supreme Court decision that took place 10 years ago. U.S. Supreme Court decision, as has been clearly highlighted and outlined, said corporations were people. And then the continued assault with decision after decision that has only weakened campaign finance laws. There's something that can be done about it, though. But it can only happen if the American people exercise their voice, our voice, which the leadership in this room, the advocates in this room, you led the effort to make sure New Mexico was part of that solution. So please give yourselves a round of applause for the work that you've already done. So I'm going to share with you some prepared remarks that I put together, and I'm going to jump into this a little bit more, but Citizens United decision is one of the most corrosive Supreme Court cases this country has seen in modern times. It corrupted the system, it eroded Americans' trust in our government, and it placed the value of money ahead of what's right. In the past 10 years, you've seen it. $4.4 billion in outside money spent to influence federal elections. $1 billion was dark money, completely untraceable. Let that sit in. 86% of all outside spending since 1990 came after the Citizens United decision. 86% of all outside spending since 1990, the year I graduated high school, has come since Citizens United. This created a system where dark money is king, and it's going to take all of us to do something to overturn it. Breaking the grip dark money has on our politics is one of the most transformative changes we can bring up with votes, with activism, and with organizing. Congressman John Sarbanes has been a leading voice in the House of Representatives in this effort. You may recognize his name from the work that his father did as well. One of those pieces of legislation that was overturned, Sarbanes-Oxley. John travels the country and makes sure that he's carrying this message, and I want to quote John. He says, "Dark money corrupts. It stops real reform, real progress from occurring. It gives a larger vote to those with fatter wallets than the people in this room." One of the first votes that I had to take as a member of the House after my father passed away in 2012 with a Republican majority in the House was a provision to make it my father, as you know, passed away from about stage 4 lung cancer. He wasn't a smoker. He was an iron worker. He was a welder. One of the chemicals that got Dad sick was beryllium. That vote made it easier for corporations to expose workers to beryllium. It weakened the standard of the amount of beryllium that a worker could be subjected to legally. The same exposure that has taken the lives of so many fellow New Mexicans and fellow Americans. What would lead to that? What would lead to a vote that would make it easier for people to get sick on the job and die? The undue influence of outside dark money. Stories like my dad are why I fought so hard to do my due diligence to win back a Democratic majority in the U.S. House of Representatives, which you all were instrumental in. The first bill that was voted out of the U.S. House of Representatives under this new majority, following a Republican majority that was in power when the Citizens United decision came down, was H.R. 1. Congressman John Sarbanes described this as caffeinating the conversation, caffeinating the activism across the country, because John said, look, if there's not a recognition by all U.S. House members, all senators, any candidate running for office, or any elected official holding office, that you lose the American people because they know what's going on. The system's rigged, and it's rigged against them unless they're billionaires, unless they're the 0.1% most wealthy in the country. If there would not be action to undo that, then what policies will follow? Now, we recognize that Leader McConnell was not excited about taking up H.R. 1, as Senator Udall will share the story. But it's critically important that coming into this new Democratic majority, that we were clear to the American people that we heard them and we were going to answer the call. As we were going to move so many other pieces of legislation to address gun violence in America, to make sure we're moving real policies to act on climate, that we were going to end pay discrimination against women in America, the Equality Act, making sure that we were requiring prescription drug companies to negotiate with Medicare to lower prescription drug prices. And in doing so, we were going to take that savings and expand coverage for Medicare beneficiaries to include vision, dental, and hearing care. But it was important to pass this package. And I want to talk about that a little bit. H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which is the most sweeping government legislation that's been adopted in modern times, expands and protects voting rights. It repeals Citizens United. It ends gerrymandering in America. It empowers people to have a larger say in our government and elections. It prevents special interests from hiding their donors. And again, it's one of the most important bills that we can pave the path to get all of these other core values addressed. Access to health care, education, investment in communities, supporting children and families, and protecting immigrant communities. Now, I know that we can work together to be able to break this grip. There's a few other things I wanted to highlight that are in this package, some of which that have already been shared with us. In 2016, I'm going to give you one example of one group. The NRA spent $35 million in dark money in 2016 alone. Since the decision in 2010, the NRA has spent nearly 14 times more in dark money than before. 10 of the 17 biggest corporate contributors to outside groups in 2018 cycle were from oil and gas companies. 76% of Americans, as it laid out, believed, and they still believe, that government is run by, quote, a few big interests looking out for themselves. 11 mega donors gave $1 billion to super PACs and races in 2010 to 2018. That's more than 1/5 of the total $4.5 billion. 11 donors, 1/5 of the $4.5 billion. Now, this legislation is critically important because it includes a few other things. Did you know that it's legal for members of the U.S. House of Representatives to serve on corporate boards today? I want to assure you I don't. But it's legal. Think about the conflicts that inherently exist. It's hard to put words on all the challenges that we're facing across the country. Just This weekend, a few of us went on a trip to go investigate the refugee camps down in Matamoros. Refugee camps that were established by President Trump and Stephen Miller. Comprehensive immigration reform is another one of those policies that the supermajority of the American people support in adopting. President Trump and Stephen Miller are complicit in some of the worst human rights violations that we've seen around the world. My colleagues that were on the trip that have traveled to other parts of the world to see refugee camps as well, to go and inspect them, said these were the worst conditions that they've ever seen people in. We don't treat animals like this. And people are living in those conditions. Young moms that I spoke to that shared their stories with me that were fleeing, often one of three of the Northern Triangle countries, the three countries in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, where if you look at the statistics, are amongst the worst when it comes to homicide. They're fleeing because their partner, a loved one, was killed. They've been threatened with murder or rape. Their children threatened with the same. What parent wouldn't make that journey? They're in a camp now where the Mexican government has refused to invite the UN in. There's no humanitarian effort other than a few volunteers that are there providing care. What's stopping us from moving these policies forward? Each and every one of the ones you've laid out. Overturning Citizens United, flipping all these policies over for the good American people. It's that undue influence of outside money. And there's a reason why for years this has been popular with Democrats, Republicans, and independents. It was true in 2016, it was true in 2018, and it will be true in 2020. And that's why it's so critically important that the work that you're doing continues to grow. The advocacy that you have shared that has transformed the New Mexico delegation. My colleague that was there before, Steve Pierce, was a supporter of the Citizens United decision. He was not one of our Republican colleagues that supported overturning it. He defends it still today. Elections have consequences. And it's critically important that people get on the record through co-sponsorships, authoring of legislation, public statements, whatever it may be, but that we're all held accountable by the American people to make sure that we're able to get this done. Now, I just want to share as I conclude, and then you open this up to the larger conversation with questions. While we witnessed, as a delegation of 17 members, the most horrific conditions that I've ever seen people subjected to, there was something positive that happened. When we were crossing back into the United States, there was a young little girl, 6 years old, Down syndrome. She had been diagnosed by 2 doctors with a chronic heart condition. Now, I'm not a medical provider, but it was the diagnosis that she had a little hole in her heart. Days earlier, she was screened by contracted providers at the port of entry. They screened her and said she's not sick, and they sent her back to the refugee camp. Well, she happened to be on the bridge that day when we were coming back to the United States with her mom and with her brother. We met her, and we learned the story. There was one of the doctors that was there with her. There was an advocate, and there was an attorney, and they shared what was happening. And so myself and Congressman Castro and Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut, Marcy Captor from Ohio, Nanette Barragan from California, we began visiting with some of the officers that were there, and they said, well, we'll call a supervisor, and they wouldn't tell us which supervisor they called, and so we kept asking, and there soon was a bottleneck. And this is not on U.S. soil. They were checking to see if you had a document before you'd present yourself on U.S. soil, and the reason is that the laws of the United States of America allow any individual that is fleeing these violent parts of the world, when they step on U.S. soil, to turn themselves over to federal authorities and make their case. A law that was signed into law by a Republican president, George W. Bush. So that's why they were there stopping people before they get there. But a bottleneck began to develop, and a few supervisors came in to see what was going on. Fortunately, one of those supervisors was willing to hear us out. That little girl was brought in with her family. She was able to cross with us, with a few other babies. And they tried to usher the members of Congress away because we had another tour. We said, well, we're not leaving until we know she's okay. So we stayed and we waited, we waited, we waited. One of the doctors that diagnosed this little girl was a physician in Pennsylvania at a children's hospital. And he had, he or she, the physician had committed to providing care to this little girl. If only she could get to Philadelphia. That little girl's in Philadelphia today. And you may wonder, well, why is Ben Ray telling me this story as we're here to talk about Citizens United? Because one person can make a difference. By speaking up, by showing up, by being present, by not letting people discourage us from taking actions that we know that are right, one person can make a difference. And it's an honor to be in a room full of people that are making a difference. So thank you. The work's not done, though. In order to get this done, we're going to have to defeat this president. We have to win back a majority in the U.S. Senate. Because as long as Mitch McConnell is there, not only will we get more conservative judges from across America, he's going to refuse to allow any of this to be heard. So let's continue our work state by state and use every tool that we have until we're able to get the job done. The future of our country is at stake, and President Kennedy reminded us that every generation has a responsibility. I think we have a couple, maybe a few. And we know climate change is in front of us. But in order to do everything we must to act on climate change, we need to overturn Citizens United as well.